Okay. Are you all ready? Ready? Okay. So, welcome everybody to this session on European digital economy. It's a bit unfortunate that we have to compete with another session on an also a very important issue, which is the energy crisis. It's really unfortunate because actually that's a twin challenge here, which isn't competing, but actually is complementing. Digital technologies can help a lot in dealing with the energy and climate change crisis here, and vice versa. Also, the digital technology should actually also take into account their footprint on energy too. So we're not competing, we are actually complementing each other, and if you're here, don't feel bad that you don't care about climate change. Digital is an enabler for dealing with this challenge here. So in this session we're going to concentrate on digital technologies and what kind of policies would we need in order to make sure we get the full potential out of these digital technologies here. It's very well known that at the firm level, the use of digital technologies such as advanced robotics, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, among others, are very important enabling technologies for innovation activities, creating new products, processes, but also ways of producing and ways of servicing customers here, and therefore leading to higher firm productivity and firm growth here. Yet we don't always see that in the productivity statistics here, and not for all countries here, and particularly at the EU level there is since a long time a concern that we are not seeing the impact of digital technologies on productivity growth, and that EU firms may actually be missing this potential here. At the same time, when we look at this relationship between digital technologies and productivity and growth, we do see an increasing dispersion of productivity results here, where particularly digital technology sectors and digital technology using sectors are characterized by winner-take-all dynamics here, where only a few firms are actually being able to ride on the digital technology train here and be pushing the frontier of technology growth and productivity growth in their sector here. This holds not only in the digital technology creating sectors, but also in digital technology using sectors, such as, for instance, in pharma or in automobiles as well. And again, that the impact of this winner-take-all dynamics plays particularly in Europe here, because we're fearing that we're missing a bit on the winners in this sector here, that we don't have the big tech companies that are pushing at the frontier here, the winners, but that our EU firms are more likely to be stuck behind and on the losing side here. And from our own research that we've been doing on this, it's maybe not particularly the larger firms, which particularly in digital using sectors may be sufficiently up to scale to use the digital technologies. It's particularly our SMEs that could actually be on the losing side here compared to US SMEs, for instance. And not only the older SMEs, but also the younger SMEs here. And in that respect, there is definitely an issue on the EU policy agenda for making sure that not only we're missing in the digital technology creation, but also in the digital technology using sectors here where the EU already might have an initial lead here, but might be losing that lead because we're missing on the leading firms here. And then there is the issue of the shocks that we've been seeing. The COVID shock was a shock that actually allowed for firms to catching up here. But again, there we also do see from research that also this shock had actually further exacerbated the divergence here, that it also created few winning firms here, few winning technologies that particularly thrived during the crisis here, but it wasn't really a moment of catching up, not yet here. And again, that raises the issue of where the EU is in terms of on the digital frontier here. So that leaves a lot of questions to be addressed by the panel, and I'm very happy that we have a very high quality level of panels, all superstars in this area here, with various different perspectives on the discussion here. And we will be discussing how all these trends in digital play out for EU firms here, what challenges do EU firms face, what opportunities, and then particularly also what impact would that have on policy making here, what kind of policy making do we need here. So lots of big questions here. I'm sure that you're very much looking forward to what our panel members have to say on this here, so I'm going to give the floor as soon as possible to them here. We will start with Amaryllis Verhoeven, who is head of unit in DG Growth here, responsible for let me check that I say this correctly here. So responsible for digital transformation of industry here. So as you can see, really on target for this topic here. So she will be sketching a bit what's currently going on the EU policy scene with respect to digital technologies here, in order to see, do we have the right kind of policy tools that we are deploying or not. So Amaryllis, the floor is yours to kick off with some introductory remarks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Renilde, and good morning to everybody. I'm very thrilled to be here, indeed, in this very high-level panel, so I feel very honored. Allow me, before I say a few words about what we do in the European Commission, allow me maybe to pick up on a few of the things that you have said, Renilde. First of all, Europe lagging behind versus big tech. Yes, we hear that, and to some extent it is true. But I would also like to stress the strength Europe has. Yeah? We are frontrunners in a number of technologies. Think of 5G, but there is also others. And then we have other strengths as well. We are the largest industrial powerhouse. We have our single market. And we have high-quality, top-level R&I. So, lagging behind, yes, but digital transformation should not only be a story of catching up or trying to have us compete with big tech. Let's start from our strengths. Second, indeed, digital transformation is still a big challenge. Yeah? And what we see, and we have reports on that, we have our DAISY index, which shows actually where firms are in digitalization, shows that indeed, in particular, traditional industries in Europe, so the digital users, very much still lag behind. They don't reap the benefits of what digitalization can bring. Not all of them, of course, but many of them, and in particular, and that is worrisome, the small and medium-sized enterprises. So there we need to play catch-up. And then picking up, that's the third remark, yes, the COVID crisis has been an accelerator for digitization, for all of us, by the way. Yeah? But I think that the current crisis can and should be an accelerator as well. Because if you think about it, digital is not an end in itself. It's a tool. It's a tool like any other tool. Yeah? But it's a very powerful tool that firms can use to become not only more innovative and competitive, but also to become greener, to reduce their energy bills, to help optimize the use of energy. It is also tools that companies can use in order to better manage supply chains. And in the current global context, with all the disruptions, we see that these are real advantages. So, and I'm mentioning this because when focusing on digitalization, I think we always have to have back in our mind not only, digitalization as an end in itself, but the purpose. And for us, key purposes, the real reason why we want to push digital is not only innovation, but also digital for green, digital for better management of supply chains, digital as a lever for the industry to really stay afloat in the current times. So, with these preliminary remarks, what is it we do? Well, I'm not going to bore you because I have only 5 minutes. We don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution. Yeah? We have to use a mix of policies and a mix of tools. Money is one. And you know that in the RFF, which came on the table in the wake of the COVID crisis, it's been a big lever for unlocking investment in digitalization, and some member states really are taking that very serious. Very important. But money is not only public money, it's also using the private levers, of course. And there we can do a lot of market making by making smart use of public procurement, standardization policy, I mentioned, very important. And there we have to do a lot. We have to set the right priorities and then make sure that when we know what are our priorities, we can go fast. Standardization is going too slow still in Europe, and that's why we came up with our standardization strategy. Regulation, yes, not regulating per se, but where needed. As you know, we went for regulation in the data sphere with the Data Act, the Data Governance Act. Why? Because we want to promote a fair allocation and access to data. And that's indeed a response to the threat of the winner-take-all. Same in the platforms world, where we came up with the DSA and DMA. Why? Because, of course, we want to curb platform dependency and make sure that platforms, which are becoming almost part of our infrastructure, take their responsibility serious. But then that's not all. There's more to be done. Supply chains, I mentioned it already. Supply chains are disrupted, and digital transformation cannot take place unless we have some key essential elements here. And it all starts with chips, and that's why we went for the CHIPS Act, which is unlocking a whole portfolio, but also a set of rules to make sure that as Europe, we can be also a powerhouse when it comes not only to the design, but also to the manufacturing of chips, and I'm sure that others will say more about that. Chips, good. But what about the rest of the raw materials? And now we see crises on raw materials. We will act on that shortly, still before the end of the year. But more generally, with all the crises following one another, we think actually that we need to have a better infrastructure equipping us and the member states with the tools we need in order to cope with crisis situations. Make sure that we have the critical technologies and the critical products in Europe, and also make sure, and that's an important one, that our single market, which is the basis for our companies to operate, can stay afloat as much as possible, even in crisis times. And that's actually the reason why we will table very, very soon the single market emergency instrument. So stay tuned on that. Another tool that we're using, and which is actually quite close to my heart, digitalization. Many companies to which we speak are like, yeah, okay, we have understood digital is good, but what exactly is it I need? What is it exactly we can need? Because skilling is also still a problem, awareness is a problem. And that's why we believe, apart from working horizontally, it is also important to drill down more in ecosystem per ecosystem. And that's the last tool I will mention, so very briefly. As part of our industrial policy, we have designed a new tool, which are the so-called transition pathways. What are these? These are processes whereby we bring together the stakeholders, the key stakeholders in a particular ecosystem. Tourism was the first, yeah? Private stakeholders, public stakeholders, and we make them talk and reflect on what are the opportunities for digitalization, the opportunities for greening, the opportunities for becoming more resilient. And once we know what are the challenges and the opportunities, then what is it we will jointly do together? And I'm mentioning the tourism sector, yeah? Might not be the first you would think of in digitalization, but that was the first transition pathway we put in place because it was in the wake of the COVID crisis. Tourism sector had been very hard hit. And that transition pathway has come to the conclusion that what is really needed, for instance, in the tourist system is a data space, a dedicated data space, giving all players a certain level of predictability, allowing also to better manage tourism flows and to address green concerns or over-tourism concerns on that basis. And that's now what we're working on. This is not legislation. This is a core industrial policy project, and it is having that sort of level of granularity which is also needed once you go deeper down into the very specifics of the ecosystems. I think I stop here.
Yep,
I haven't mentioned everything, but
no.
I'm happy to come back. Thanks a lot.
Right. Thanks a lot, Amaryllis, and I really appreciated also your emphasis on the importance of the single market, avoiding fragmentation, and also open access, the open data space, and the transition process that you mentioned. Definitely, and we will definitely talk about the CHIP Act too in these dimensions of the importance of strategic autonomy. We'll definitely come back to that discussion here. So next in line is Eva Mejdel. She is the Bulgarian representation in the European Parliament here, but she's also a member of the ITRE committee here. So she's definitely also on this topic, and she's a very special emphasis on young, mobile, and small, medium-sized enterprises here. So what's your perspective in terms of European Parliament on what's going on at the EU level? Is the European Commission taking the right initiatives or not? The floor is yours, Eva.
First of all, thank you very much for having me, and very glad that we can have this sort of more thought-provoking session powered by Brugo and all the thinking that goes through in your annual report and so on. It actually feeds into our work very often. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this session. But I'm always very cautious because I know there's a lot of experts in various fields. So I will probably start with pointing out about 3 points. And I would start by saying that I would like to think of the recent big shocks that have struck us within Europe and the world as some sort of an awakening moment for the European Union. I think the conversations that entail technologies today go way beyond the conversations we had in my previous term as a member of the European Parliament. Why is that? I think first because for the first time, in more general terms, technology and the point on digitalization and digital policy is no longer seen as some sort of a niche, geek discussion. You could see it present in every part of the conversation, whether we are talking about defense, climate, or agriculture, and another field. The second reason, I think, is COVID was already mentioned. I think it was an awakening moment to understand that digitalization goes beyond having a Zoom account. It goes into better connectivity, access to internet, to Wi-Fi, and I think businesses saw the benefits of digitalizing some of their processes for a very short period of time. And I hope and I believe it helped them accelerate some of these processes. And the third point, why it is a very awakening moment, and I hope we'll take it as such, is of course the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical turmoil it has created. I think it's very interesting that we have parallel sessions going on energy security and gas supply, and our session at the moment, because I do use this parallel often. I think the current crisis has woken us up to the threats that are posed by authoritarian states. And it more clearly shows that we are in a real battle between autocracies and democracies. And I believe we would see that battle fought, if now in the energy front, that battle fought more and more often into the technological front. My second point goes to the fact that I think we are now seeing the European Union as a more strategic actor, as an enabler. And when it comes to the tech files, first of all, I wouldn't put all the tech files that we've been working on the same page. I wouldn't, see them as the same sort of files. I think when we speak about the Gdpr or the DSA, we see a strong focus on consumer protection, which of course it's a good thing. But when we are talking about the CHIPS Act, for example, I think for the first time, perhaps, we are seeing a very strategic outlook and forward-looking, enabling legislation, so to say. And another example, if I look at the DMA, of course, it's a tool that would help address the market power of those few superstar firms. But in the same time, I think we need to know that, referees don't win the game. It's the players that win the game. And so I would like to see more strategic legislation that would enable companies also in that field to grow and perhaps become important into their sphere. I like to refer to that point as a digital jigsaw. I think we spent quite a lot of time, discussing the different roadmaps that we have, but sometimes I think it's difficult for us to determine the goals of our digital policy and what should those goals be in a more strategic way, in a more bigger picture way, so to say. But as I said, I think we are making our steps in that direction. And last point is referring to, I think, to the European companies that we are enabling, that we would like them to scale up. But in the same time, I think it doesn't mean that we need to be protectionist. It doesn't mean we need to shield ourselves away from other economies and other countries that we might see as competitors. And here, I think, when we speak about competition, I think we need to look in different ways the way we see competition with the US and China. Competition with the US is not a zero-sum game, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily the same as competition with China. And so this is why I think if we are to lead in that sphere, we should continue abiding by the principles we've been abiding so far of free market and in the same time working with our international allies, building bridges with those allies with which we can trust. And I would agree that perhaps one way and a good example is the AI Act, where we are trying to work on standards with those partners. And I'll wrap it up with a sentence that I think if we are to achieve or aim in this direction, I think on one hand we need to commit meaningful resources, and that sometimes can be difficult given the current multiple crisis moment we find ourselves in, but also political will, and we have to do those aims and goals after all. So this would be my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that it's very much in line with the Commission here. So I really also like that you stress that the digital technology is really, it's not a purpose per se, it's really an enabler here, and also this move more towards strategic issues of digital industrial policy here. We will come back to the discussion of how the geopolitical situation with the US and China will lead to more strategic autonomy, also going more into protecting. I'm glad to hear that you actually warn against and that we should look for win-wins here. But perhaps also in terms of strategic position of the EU, in terms of digital on a world scale, also can the EU become actually a leader in terms of global regulations, standard setting here compared to the others, so that will definitely also be something we can pick up in the discussion afterwards. But before we start on the discussion, the next speaker is Vincent Assillot. He's head of the Econ department at France Stratégie, which is an internal think tank belonging to the French Prime Minister's administration here. He works on many different issues here, but particularly also related more at the macro level on the link with productivity and also with trade issues here. He has a history in DG Trade as well here, and both at the French Minister's private office for trade. So we will put more the emphasis on from a member state like France, so what's the role of digital in terms of productivity and also in terms of external competitiveness here? Vincent, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As just was mentioned before, it's absolutely one of the key challenges for our societies, because the digitalization has so many interactions with all the crucial challenges that we are facing, like, of course, the ecological transition, but also social welfare, the functioning of our democracies, of course, job creation, the impact on productivity, the value-added creation by this sector, and the digitalization of all the traditional industries. We know that we have a key challenge in Europe for that, because some of our strong industries, like the automotive, but also most of all other manufacturing sectors, are being impacted by disrupted technological innovation from digitalization. And if we miss this disruptive innovation, as we did, for example, for the internet revolution, of course we will lose out most of our comparative advantage in terms of production and exports and all that. So it's absolutely crucial for us to boost the growth of innovative companies, the digitalization of all companies in our society. And we know also that digitalization is absolutely crucial also for energy savings. And we have also a strong challenge in that respect. For example, it's 20% of British households which are using IoT to optimize their energy consumption. It's only 8% in average in the EU. So we really need to develop that because also, as we know from some studies, the digitalization can help reduce by 20% energy consumption in transport, for example, in building energy consumption in many different sectors. And of course, we know that we have the challenge of reducing energy consumption by the digital economy and also the circular economy. So we need to incentivize the companies to first, of course, use much more green energies in data storage, and also to develop the recyclability of their devices. For that, we could have some incentives. For example, a proportionate deposit charge according to the degree of recyclability of a smartphone, an electronic device. That would be not impacting negatively purchase power of the households, but that would be a strong incentive for the companies to really incorporate recyclability in the design of their devices. And we know that for rare earth and rare metals, we really have a strong challenge to really develop the circular economy. And among other challenges in relation with digital economies, of course, as was mentioned, the single market is a strong, powerful engine to develop the innovative companies in Europe. But we need probably to develop a specific regulatory framework at the EU level for SMEs to avoid our startup and SMEs to have to comply to 27 different regulatory frameworks. They could choose whether to comply with the European regulatory framework or with each of the national regulatory frameworks in the countries where they are developing their business. That will help because we know that the lack of large digital companies from Europe at global level, it's in relation with the fact that the single market is still not a proper way to help small companies to develop at European scale. Of course, one of the key challenge is to increase the investment in skills. It's absolutely key to develop the digitalization of the economy, and in particular soft skills. We've published recently a report on soft skills showing the importance, basically, of the soft skills for innovative companies and for the transformation of public and private organization. And that's absolutely key in developing innovative company. Another subject, I will probably stop there, it's the fact that given the complexity of our regulations, we probably need to develop much more sandboxes, or regulatory sandbox. With probably at the EU level, we could set up a committee with some MPs, with some experts, that would be able to respond to requests by a company to be able to experiment an innovation based, of course, on the scientific arguments, but also if that innovation is in line with reaching our sustainable development goals. And of course, that would imply to have an itinerary evaluation, but we really need to develop that at European level. I've experienced some innovative companies which are blocked in the development and the experiment of their innovation because of some regulations which basically are not justifiable when you look at the situation. It's, for example, we have the example of a company which is able to basically deal the waste in the bin and to produce high quality compost from the bin. But the regulation that we would have to separate first the bio-waste in order to produce the compost after that. It's a big problem for them because they have a technology, a digital technology, that help separate the bio-waste and produce very high quality compost. And so thinking that because citizens are separating the bio-waste at the origin, It's of course a guarantee of the quality of the compost. It's a little bit difficult to believe. So we have there a list of these challenges. Another one, which is in particular true for France, but for many other EU countries, is to mobilize much more national savings to finance venture capital, to finance the growth of companies. So we really, when we compare ourselves in terms of the level of venture capital and percentage of GDP, compared with the US, compared with China, it's much lower. And we know that's one of the main vector of the development of innovative companies and their growth at a global scale. So that's one of the key challenges, of course.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Vincent. I really also liked that you made this point that the disruptive character of digital here, and that would lead also to much more adaptability in terms of having much more flexible, including flexible labor markets and the skills agenda that you mentioned. I think we definitely will be coming back to that. And then this issue of regulation and SME-specific framework for making sure that the complexity of regulation doesn't become a barrier here, particularly avoiding fragmentation and finding a good balance here and using more experimentation and sandboxes here. So maybe in the discussion we can see the extent to which this has been used and how effective this kind of interventions, SME-specific interventions have been here. And then also this issue of financing and trying to mobilize more resources for venture capital funding some of these startups here. Again, to which extent was COVID kind of catching up possibility in terms of venture capital, or is this going to be a long-term trend or not here? But this these three speakers looked more from the policy perspective. I think it's now high time to also turn to the actual stakeholders in this area, and we have two sides to these stakeholders here. We will first start with Jo de Boek here, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at IMEC and also Executive Vice President. IMEC was already very well known in Flanders and Belgium here, but recently also at the EU level has become really famous here, because it's really a leader in terms of the research and pre-commercial development in terms of microelectronics here. So I'm sure, and given that you also is very well acquainted with the technical details, going really deep into the electronics here, he will have a very good view on what the position of Europe can be in terms of these electronics value chains here, and then particularly also what role research and development and support for that can actually play to make Europe a leader also in that part of the value chain here. So, Jo, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Renilde, for the very nice opening comments. Feel humbled in this community here on the panel, because we're only one player. It's a tall order to represent for Europe all the research and innovation power we have, because it's quite a bit. But I'd like to give a bit of a view in that perspective. We of course need the policies, we need the support, and we need the views that are brought to the table today already. What I'd like to do is start with two opening comments, maybe one on that ecosystem that's been talked about before. It is very important that we understand that digital economy goes all the way down to understanding how chips are made and manufactured, to who designs them, to who produces them, to who makes use of it. And we have had decades of what we call happy scaling. We made the chip smaller, more functional, provided more function to your smartphones, enabled cars to be a bit more safer, the energy grid to be a bit more grid-like, etc., etc. Financial markets, all of these retail sectors that have been digitized. The examples have been shown, but this required actually over the past 10 years a much closer interconnect between the services offered, the products being envisaged, and the technology that is going to be needed or was needed to put them in the market. So stepping back 15, 20 years ago, we provided chips, somebody else did something with it, and I'm saying we as the the industry sector that was producing the chips and researching the future generations. Today it's different, and it's different because indeed these services, the needs and the demands of the users in the end, it could be authorities and say even defense, down to us as consumers, what we need to carry in our smartphones. That need is directly connected to the innovation that you have at the chip and the technology level. And I think one example which is important for Europe is, for instance, the automotive sector. We have giants there. Volkswagen Group has 670,000 people, so it's a giant. Clearly, there has been wake-up calls throughout this sector because there have been companies coming from the sideway and really disrupting the way cars are built and cars are used and the way we, as users of those robots today, foresee how they will bring us from point A to B in the future. So this is a real digitization revolution because the chips in these cars, like I'm going to just call out one of the examples we all know well, Tesla is designing its own chips because they consider the car a bunch of chips with eyes and ears and a brain inside that actually takes you from A to B, but it is a service that is provided. And that is clearly the way they do this is they have a very, very close connect between their view of the service, the way the car is built, and the chips that will drive it. They have their own designers, they have their very, very close connect to the technology. This is a disruptive way of innovating. And IMEC is one, but we have players in France, Leti, we have players in Germany, Fraunhofer, and research and technology organizations throughout Europe can take bits and pieces, and when we bring this together, a very powerful setting of trying to really connect the full stack, as we say, from the service, the products, the needs, down to the changes in technology. And say, I'm going to call out, I'm not going to go technical, Renilde, you almost enthused me to go into the technology details, but just say quantum computing, right? And without even trying to explain it in this audience, which I probably even couldn't, quantum is a new way of doing computing, and we will need it in some sectors, and we will need a heterogeneous system from servers centrally to what we carry around in our pockets or what we drive around on the street. This is a distributed compute environment, and this will be composed of so many different chips. I mentioned eyes and ears, sensors. I'm sure we'll hear more about it as well. This distributed compute part up until the cloud services that we use. And this ecosystem is where Europe has a lot of strengths. From technology development, we have a company like ASML, which is a giant. It's one of those companies in the chip production stack that if you take it away, the whole chip production for advanced and important chips that we use today is going to collapse. So we have really strongholds in Europe as one example, but there are many more of the same nature that will be important in a global ecosystem of semiconductors. We have the research strengths, we have of course the design and still manufacturing, and we need to boost that. That's where the CHIPS Act looks into as well. How can we make sure that we create more demand in Europe for the different sectors that we will need these chips and digitization, and how we translate that in local production. It's not a lost game, and I'm looking at some of the questions that look at timelines for that. The timeline is when you start, right? I mean, the important element is take the strengths and build on those, and that's my second point, and then I'll leave it to the discussion, is to really partner in this ecosystem. Find the like-minded economies, find the companies that currently are already very much engaged in this ecosystem, bring them together from the research phase, as we do at IMEC, for instance, up until how these ecosystems take these technologies to market, consumer or authorities, and everything in between. So I think there, of course, regulations and policies and investments are very important. Startups play a key role to make the whole ecosystem dynamic and keep the giants on their edge, on their toes, because they can be disrupted if they're not careful. But all of that partnership model, I think, is very important. So again, to sum up my introductory comments, make sure we consider the full stack in both legislation and innovation, and then make sure we partner and we consider in each partnership, each partner needs to have something the other one wants, otherwise the partnership is, well, not very solid. So let's build on the strength, so we have something to offer in these partnerships, and this will include, I'm sure, an increased production and an increased demand of microchips, but definitely, again, a full stack strength throughout the ecosystem. I'd like to keep it there because time's running, and I'm sure there's going to be interactions further.
Thanks a lot, Jo. That was really perfect. So I think you made some very important points. First of all, in terms of really this closer connection between the use and the users versus the production here. So my question, but also for the later discussion, would then be, does it also mean that we need to have then the production very close to the users here? The production, the design, and the research, does it really need to be closely located here? Is that a reason for having much more strategic autonomy and expertise and production in Europe here? And another very important point you made is not seeing chips as a homogeneous good, but really as really the heterogeneity of chips. Not all chips are the same. You have standardized chips, but you've also highly specialized here, and you have to look at the whole stack and the whole combination here. And that also should be reflected in the ecosystems that you need to have in this here. You mentioned the EU is strong in terms of ecosystems, in some of its strongholds like automobiles or like pharma here. But my question then also is related to this disruptive nature here. How stable are these ecosystems here, and how robust are they to take up this whole transition here? And that brings back also Amarili's proposal on how to work on the transition process here. Do we have the right stakeholders in these ecosystems to make sure that you get the transition? Really definitely also liked your emphasis on startups as being very important player in this transition here, particularly because of the disruptive nature here. So a lot of things actually come together here, and we're sure we will take up that during the discussion here. But before we go to the discussion, we have one very important last panel member here, which also represents an important active stakeholder here, which is Nicolas Villa. He's the executive vice president at MasterCard here, who deals with government engagement programs, but has a lot of interest here, including digital innovation, but not exclusive here. But I think the position of MasterCard here definitely is also the extent to which particularly digital payments have allowed a lot of digital adoption to take place here, but in itself is also a very important sector where lots of new players have been created together with large incumbent firms here. So it's a very good example of, on the one hand, an ecosystem in itself, but also an enabling ecosystem for other digital technologies here. So very much looking forward, Nicolas, to see your views on what's going on.
Thank you, Renil, and thank you for the friends of Bruegel. We are proud partners of the fantastic work that they do, and we're very happy to be here. Over the last couple of days, a lot has been said about how our world has been changing and how rapid the change has been. From a MasterCard perspective, we focus on two things, and I hope here I can represent also the rest of the financial technology firms in Europe and around the world. First, we started to focus on the consumer changes and the trends in that specific area. We saw, for example, throughout the pandemic, how consumers started to demand, of course, for electronic payments to be made instead of cash payments or instead of face-to-face. And we also saw, of course, as an industry, a huge rise in terms of contactless programs. Not only people started to work on Skype, but they wanted to basically pay online for their services, but also when in a physical space like a transport and transit authority, they wanted to pay contactless. So we saw the acceleration of those type of technologies in the financial space. We also then focus on making sure that our network, which is connecting 2.2 billion people globally and millions of enterprises, many of them SMEs, remain resilient, remain trustful in terms of cybersecurity and fraud, and remain scalable. These were the two focus areas for the last few years for us. What also means is that we started in Europe in particular to partner with a number of government agencies in the SME space. The small and medium enterprises has been probably the most impacted by the pandemic, and they're the ones that are basically going to the largest turmoil today. In particular, and you touch on tourism in the tourist sector. Mm-hmm. Tourist industry was down 76% in Europe over the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And so what we started to do with many partners in the public and the private sector, we started to basically help SMEs get paid, pay, and go digital. Get paid means that we provided infrastructure and acceptance for them to be able to receive digital payments at the moment that the customers could not go to the stores or to the location. But we also helped many of them go online and start to trade their services. We saw early evidence in Ireland, for example, on how those SMEs who had a very solid presence with the website were able to basically keep their business and lose less of their business to the ones that basically were brick and mortar. So we saw this with this area. And we work a lot in the tourist space. In the tourist space, we started to work with a number of national and local agencies to help them understand what was happening to the tourist corridors, which corridors were starting to close, open, and so on. And in partnership with the Chamber of Commerce in Paris, we launched the Barometer of the Parisian tourist economy, which will use SME to understand, which tourists are now coming in. Is it the Germans? Are the Americans coming back? What do they actually really want when they come into this country? And how can I tailor my services face-to-face or online to this type of programs? So these are some of the activities that we do. Of course, through the Ukrainian crisis, we started to enable the payment of emergency funds to individuals where there was displaced both within Ukraine as well as in Europe with our partners, being the banks and the merchants. But we also started, for example, in Warsaw in Poland to set up a program to help those displaced people set themselves up with new businesses in Poland. So what infrastructure would they need? What education would they need to have? Will their new website be cyber secured or not? And finally, on the Ukrainian side, on the 8th of July, we launched an accelerator program for fintech companies in partnership with the Central Bank of Ukraine and with the Ministry of Digital Innovation to basically help an already thriving sector, fintech, basically become more solid and start to globalize their services. Now, fintech to me is a very interesting conversation in Europe. I will argue that when we said the euro is falling behind in technology, that is not the case for the financial and specifically the fintech sector. And I would argue that this is the result of very progressive, very inclusive regulation on open banking. Think about PSD2, that has created a wave of new companies and new investment into the technology space in the financial services. So today, 30 unicorns are based out of Europe in this wonderful sector. The technology startup investments in Q1, the first quarter of 2022 in Europe, were $33 billion, half of which, in fact more than half, on the fintech space. So through regulation and policy, we created a very thriving sector. Our role there, again, is to act as a network and to enable innovation from an application and services on top of that. So we partner today in Europe with 70% of the most innovative neobanks and fintechs. Bank in the Netherlands, Nickel in France, N26 in Germany, and many other ones. And our role is to basically help them grow their services, but also internationalize. We are providing access to our network, to our consumers, so they're starting to move across Europe and basically open new activities, but also, for example, starting to look into South America or Southeast Asia. So that's, I think, a good way of looking into how policy and technology basically drive, in a coordinated fashion, grow the European business. Gdpr is another example that we always bring forward. When Gdpr was basically launched, we didn't look at it as a constraint, we look at this as an opportunity. So we started to apply Gdpr to our own processes, and then we set up in Ireland with IBM a joint venture called Truata, which is now providing services to the European companies, but also to other companies on the world, on how to GDPR enable their own infrastructure and their own services and application. So again, another example of how Europe, through policy regulation, basically creates new unicorns and start basically exporting internationally. The next steps for us are two, and they're actually very important in Europe. And they relate to environmental sustainability and to tourism. Environmental sustainability, we've heard it for the last couple of days, is of course a must. It's also a must for the consumers of MasterCard and of our competitors and of our partners. And so we decided last year to set up our center of gravity for sustainability in Stockholm, Sweden. We launched a sustainability innovation hub with which we are developing, and through which we are developing a number of solutions in partnership with European companies. An example there is a fintech called Autonomy, in which we invested and we are helping internationalize, And the economy created an own index called the Allen Index to assess the carbon impact of purchases of people basically using digital payments. So if you pay for your groceries and so on, what is basically the carbon footprint? And so we're basically helping them through the network of banks and merchants that we have around the world internationalize their services and tapping into hopefully the 2.2 billion consumers and helping not spend less, but basically spend better. So this is one example of the investments coming out of that construct. And last summer, in partnership with Minister Reyes Maroto in Spain, Industry and Tourism, we launched our global headquarters for tourism in Madrid. We call it a Tourism Innovation Hub. We have already today 23 projects coming out of that with European companies who are and governments who are incubating with us new solutions linked to data, to loyalty programs, and to digital payments to basically help accelerate the recovery and the reopening of the corridors, but basically make them more resilient. So in a nutshell, basically what we do is providing a scalable, trusted, and secure network, fostering innovation on top of this network from an application, services, and data perspective, and then partnering with those companies, many of them in Europe, in this very thriving environment, to basically internationalize and become more global. Over to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Nicola. I think this is really very interesting to see how fintech actually was a very successful example of an ecosystem here built around large company, but also the ecosystem together with smaller, particularly startup companies here. So whatever lesson we can take from fintech here, and definitely also the importance of the regulatory setting, how that actually helps to create unicorns. Was very illuminating here. I also liked your examples in terms of how the use of data, which is basically the core of the fintech success story here, how you can actually use that in applications like the match between supply and demand and tourism here, the German tourist in Paris here, but also the example that you raised in terms of identifying the carbon impact of purchases. So all these examples of the use of data here and how that can actually be also something that's open access to data so that you can create also new applications by young companies here. So definitely a good example where we can actually learn from more in terms of the policy agenda here. I think it's now high time to leave the floor for discussion here. I want to also leave your space for reacting a bit to the others, but I will leave that as a last round for short comments here. First, I would like to go to the audience, both online and here in situ, with questions here. See, we already have a lot of questions here. I'm going to collect all the questions together also with the ones on Slido and then distribute them a bit and you pick whichever questions here. But before we start, I think there were two questions which are very specific to you here, is how long will it take to catch up with the microchip giants like TSMC here, and is it possible to have technology sharing with other chip producing countries here, including China here? So that's a very specific question in terms of chips. I would like to give first the floor to you, and that will also leave some time for everybody to think about their questions, and we collect the questions later on. So,
maybe very brief answers to these questions as far as answers are to be given there. The timeline for catching up with Taiwan. Well, first of all, Taiwan is really ahead. And let's be clear. They super specialized in making chips for anyone who wants to use their technology. That's typically what we call a foundry. So anyone can access. For instance, through IMEC, we connect roughly about 500 startups or universities to the technology of TSMC for them to be able to design in the newest generation technology. So is there demand? Yes. This means that when we partner with companies like TSMC or Intel or the existing foundries, and we can enthuse them to invest in Europe, that is what I consider a good partnership, right? They could act on demand that is growing in Europe, that is leading the pack in new markets like the fintech market. A great example, many startups have been growing fast, and they will need chips. They know the workload, they can define the chips, they can then process them. So I'm just saying, creating the demand is thing to do number one. And so that's definitely part of also the CHIPS Act ambition. And then, of course, if you look at the timeline it takes to build a fab, to populate the fab, to train the people, because the skills are going to be very important, and starting from an existing generation of technology, you could do this in less than a decade, right? You need to build the fab a couple of years, you need to get the fab installed a couple of years, you need to get the production going another couple of years. But if you do this from an existing investments, which we hear coming to Europe today, we can look at the end of the decade at a position which is way stronger than we have today. Are we going to beat TSMC or Taiwan or the other Asian companies to that? No, but we're going to play a role. We're going to have the ambition of 20% presence in the market, something that is in the offing. Not only with the most advanced technology, but again, to make my point, in those technologies that make a big difference, we can call them advanced technologies because they are advanced, but it is more mature and more settled today in the commercial market. So let's take a long haul view at this. This digitization is not going to go away after 2030. We need to be present there. So if we start today, we do have a role to play. And then the other question is, can we partner? Or I think I partly answered that question. So yes, please, let's do this. That's what made the semiconductor technology very, very global. And of course, again, having a presence in a partnership means, as a point I made earlier as well, having something to offer in the partnership. So let's make sure we build on all of the strengths, including the need of production. So, Renilde, you asked the question, do all of the partners in the ecosystem need to be on the same spot? No, we can do a lot virtually. We can connect each other, but the connectivity is important. And that doesn't just mean, can we file an order? No, it means, can we co-design the future? Can we look ahead together on the roadmaps that was mentioned earlier and decide which are the partners we trust, which are the ones that are going to be there for life, and let's work with them and make sure that we have a presence and a reliance which is balanced.
Yeah, so use digital technologies to better connect the players in the
It's happening today. During COVID, some of my students programmed their experiments from Rome. We just came through the cloud into the clean room, they got the wafers, they can measure it. It's a connected world throughout.
Yeah, yeah. That also goes a bit against the danger of protectionism here, is we really need this open playing field. Yeah. So let's now, because I saw already quite a lot of, so where is the mic? Ah, yeah, okay. So maybe we start from the first row and then go back here. So try to be short because we have lots of questions here. Yeah.
Oh, that's hard. Okay, well, first, my compliments to the panel. I agree with just about everything I heard, including especially the notion that Europe doesn't have a deficit generally with digital, but we certainly do in some very specific areas like business and consumer online platforms. Now, one key area, of course, and this was touched on in several of the remarks, is in terms of startups and scale-ups. Europe does reasonably okay on startups, but we have challenges with scale-ups, and they've been known for a good 10 years. Problems with achieving access to venture capital, problems with issuance of initial public offerings, IPOs. Most of those that were done in the EU historically were done in the UK, which is no longer EU. And also very differential bankruptcy laws that tend to tie up resources and people for long periods of time. So these are not new observations. Those of you that have worked in the European policy space will remember Capital Markets Union was talking about this 10 years ago, but I don't perceive that anything very concrete has been done with them. So, I'd like to really raise as a challenge what can be done to try to actually get something happening in this very important space. Yep. One other that I'll try to be brief on, you touched on this issue of 27 different sets of rules. We've got a huge avalanche of new legislation coming down the pike for digital services, DMA, DGA, DSA, Artificial Intelligence Act, Data Act, you name it. Each of them has typically different mechanisms for how to deal with coordination and harmonization across the member states. Each of them deals with different problem spaces. How do we achieve some harmonization both across the problem spaces and across these different mechanisms for coordination among the member states and between the member states and the European institutions?
Yep. Thanks a lot, Scott. Very good questions here. So the one on why we're missing these scale-ups here, I think that's something that Nicola maybe can, because he mentioned these examples of unicorns here. So apparently in fintech there are these best practices. Can we learn from that? And also other alternative ways of funding to make sure that we get the scale-up. And then the fragmentation of the regulation, I think that will go to Vincent and to Amarilis here. Fragmentation within the EU, but I would also like to add on a global level too here. So to which extent can EU regulation also play a role of global leadership in terms of regulation? Yeah, but I saw many questions. So, so if we go by row.
I'll try to be very quick. Joanna Jacine from Warwick University, and thank you so much for the panel. It's so interesting. I was wondering if you could elaborate on a topic you touched on how the EU should include its regional areas, its shrinking regions, which are perhaps falling behind, such as agricultural-based manufacturing and aging population specific, and how they should be included and what tools should be used in that process, and how policy should be looked at from the EU or national perspective.
Right.
Thank you.
How to use digital technologies for regions catching up here. Maybe that's also something for Eva. Yeah, next row. Yeah. Go back to the first.
Thank you very much, also for an excellent panel. I'm Jonathan Harder, I'm from the Danish EU representation, and my question is more about the external dimension of digital and the priorities for the EU's digital diplomacy, because the EU does have a digital diplomacy. There was just an office last week opened in San Francisco. The foreign ministers had council conclusions that were quite substantial in July, and those conclusions talk about a lot of goals, more proactive promotion of EU digital relations, more coordination in multilateral fora, more strategic investment in digital infrastructure, more political, not just commercial dialogue with tech companies and so on and so forth. But we can't do it all, so my question to you all is, so priorities, where should we start? What's more important? Thanks.
Amarilis, that will be for you, maybe also for you. Yeah, there is one question on the first floor.
Yes.
First row, sorry.
Yes, hello, I'm David Garcia, fellow from Hybrid Strategy. So I think that there's one dimension of the debate of digital European policy that has been addressed quite in detail during the discussion, which is this open dimension for very ambitious Europe that is becoming more assertive and is telling all the world our market will remain open as long as you respect our values and our rules. Mm-hmm. But I think that there is also a risk or another trend that we actually see in some policy proposals of a more scared Europe that is more likely to close its borders to third country stakeholders based on the assumption that only EU native offer can actually offer the level of protection and respect the values that we expect. We see that in cloud. The Commission has accepted that the lack of EU native cloud is a market failure, not cutting-edge cloud, but simply EU native cloud. We also see in cybersecurity the current debate on certification of cloud, where we could close some of the key sectors of the EU economy to the hyperscalers, which are the infrastructure of our cloud ecosystem today. So how do you see this risk? How can we avoid? Is it realistic to think that the EU can replace all the infrastructure, for example, in the sector of cloud, by a new EU offer? Can we afford it? Can we wait until that comes? So what's your perspective on that dimension?
Yeah, so that's the discussion on strategic autonomy. How much is this driven by more defensive? Right. So, yeah.
Thank you. If you look at the degree of digitalization across the EU, you will see that some of the countries are way up, some of the countries are way down, and most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe are down. There are a few exceptions. Now, we are talking about invention, which are the countries that are at the top of the inventing. And you have US, China, France, UK, Finland, etc. But then, not everybody is there, but digitalization has to go everywhere. So there are slow adapter countries and fast adapter countries. So what can you do to make it sure that the diffusion of progress is fast. What you, Nicola, has mentioned, this is very good, but that's in a very competitive sector, financial sector. But there are sectors that are not in international competition. Government services can be digitalized. Teaching can be digitalized. Agriculture, some of the agriculture products, large and medium companies, but who are not producing for the export market. So my question is, what are the rooms, for instance, from the Commission or whoever has an idea, to make adaptation of the digital world as much as possible in those countries where this degree of digitalization is low? Thank you.
An important issue in terms of the digital services, and particularly in the public sector, and open access to data here. How important is it in the public-private sphere? Yeah, right.
Hi, my name is Bert Hecht from BBVA, Spanish bank, and I have a question concerning the enabling aspect of EU regulation when we come to real regulation. Taking the example of the AI Act, for example, you mentioned it a little bit. When it comes to regulation, we very often see that it's rather about controlling the risks. In taking the example of the AI regulation, my question would be, where should the focus shift to in the debate, which has very much been about controlling specific high-risk cases? So where should the debate of this particular file should shift to make it really more enabling?
Right. Yeah, good question. So do not do harm. Right, exactly. Yeah. Still one more question.
Thank you, Christophe Carty from Bruegel. I have a question to the MEP. You notice that you want to have legislation that promote European companies and to scale up across Europe. My question is, which legislation do you foresee exactly? And do you see the DMA as a way to promote European companies, in other words, as a tool for industrial policy rather than competition policy, because it's important for the objective of the DMA? Thank you.
Yeah, that's also a good question. Also relates a bit to the questions on Slido here, is how much is the DSA and the EMA going more in the direction of companies rather than citizens, and how to balance that supply and demand orientation. So we have quite a lot of questions here, and we have 2 minutes. So I'm going to give a last round to everyone. I'm sure we cannot finish the discussion on this here, but at least we set the scene also for continuing the discussion. And if you can just highlight a few reactions to these questions here. So, shall I start with Vincent?
Yeah, some reaction. Of course, the diversity of the question and the complexity of the subjects is, of course, one of the key subjects, the complexity of the regulations and the multiplicity, and also as the way we define our regulations at the EU level. So we really need to develop a specific regime at EU level that will be a choice for a company to choose for that regime instead of having to comply with all the national regulatory regimes. And of course, we need to improve the way we design our regulation at the EU level. For that, it's a question of the governance of the EU, of course, and there's been some discussions and by the citizen proposals to improve the way we do that, and that's some reform which are absolutely key. And clearly, these aspects, basically. We need really to have the incentive in all the regulation for the companies and the citizens to really basically implement and use the performing solutions, performing technologies, and we're very often lacking these incentives, and not just tax incentive. It's in terms of regulation, in terms of accompanying also the experiments, the innovation. So the flexibility of regulation in that respect is absolutely crucial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So the flexibility of the regulatory regime. Yeah. Eva, do you want to?
Yes, sure. I will answer very briefly two of the questions and then a little bit of thoughts that combine few of the questions. But on the AI Act, where should focus shift? I agree that to some extent currently, and the debates are ongoing, of course, currently there is truly a shift on, that's not a shift, but the discussion is focused primarily on controlling the risks. Rather than where can we strike the balance, at least. So there's a lot of work to be done on that, and I'm glad to be working alongside colleagues such as Axel Voss and Diederik Loon to try to find this balance in the conversation. Because otherwise we might end up with something that would be well protecting our citizens with the file, but will perhaps, not strike the right balance through that would enable our companies. Now I'll give you my thought a little bit further after I answer the other direct question that was posed on the DMA, which is linked to more the strategic vision of the AI. But I'll come back to that. On the DMA, I think I hinted a little bit. But your question is, should we look at it as an industrial enabler? Could it be seen in this way or more as a competition tool? I see it as a competition tool. I hope I would be wrong, because ideally the DMA will enable European startups to become scale-ups. I don't think that will happen. And again, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think it was created with the real reasoning to help those European companies. It was created to punish where it has to, or to punish this uncompetitive behavior, rightly so. That would probably be needed in certain areas. But I don't think that would necessarily help European companies. Sorry for my sobering remarks on this, but I think we need to see things as they stand today. Hopefully, again, as I said, I'm wrong. I worked on that file myself. But striking the balance, like in the AI Act, is not easy. But few general remarks which tie into this. I mentioned it in the beginning. For me, it's more important that right now we have a conversation about what is the long-term vision of the European Union when it comes to its digital policies. We often talk, I often hear it about this Brussels effect, but we need to understand that regulation is not a means but to itself. It's some sort of a means, but not an end to itself. It cannot be just that we have to regulate. I mean, the amount of times I tell the word regulate per day, I start feeling suffocated by it, that I'm not giving enough space for innovation, perhaps. We spend too much time on the nitty-gritty and not enough time talking about the big goals. So for me, it would be important to talk about these big goals, brainstorming on them to come with further strategy. And this is linked, I think, to our external policy. Whether we want to be more autonomous, whether we want to strengthen global democracy, or we want to aid a relatively uncompetitive AI industry, for example. I think these are goals that are not mutually exclusive, but sometimes they could clash. And this is why I think having this conversation is very important. In the same time, I was quite blunt on the two questions. I think time will tell, of course, and as I said, I hope I will end up being wrong in my predictions. But I think the regulatory environment we are creating could be seen as a competitive advantage in the long term. But that could be done only while being on that path, we take partners on that path as well. So if we are to influence other nations, other democratic countries to embark on the same way, and one could say we are actually seeing that to a certain extent with the US perhaps, this first mover advantage could come into our favor. Because I do believe that the democratic approach in the tech sphere is the best approach to go ahead, but we have to bring those others on the way. Otherwise, we risk becoming an island of regulation rather than a hub for business, or rather than a hub where European businesses are actually thriving. And this is why cooperation with international allies, for me, it's absolutely necessary. It's part of the basis of how we should build our digital sovereignty, because a digital influence should not be built in the difficult times we live today by showing that we are a regulatory superpower, but I think by being that superpower that could unite those global interests would put us in a much better light. In the end, I described it in the beginning, I think to a certain extent it is a race between democracies and autocracies, we need to be wise enough to see how we can, unite those that we share certain common values together in order to set the rules, but also to make sure companies could thrive in that environment.
Okay, thanks Eva for putting the whole digital industrial policy agenda in this big geopolitical context here. So, Jo, can you react to some of the last comments you want to give?
Yeah, I'll keep it very short.
Yeah.
I just wanted to drive the point home again on the startups and scale-ups and the environment that you need there, because I think it's totally important. We've seen ourselves, the rise over the past half decade, maybe a bit more, on the willingness to invest in deep tech again. It has been something, we had AI and software, that was the only thing people went to, with success, by the way, for fintech, but also there we see a lot of innovation on deep technology that's going to be needed. We see the appetite of that growing quite a bit. We have our own IMEC-related fund that is going to close over 370 million euro over 2 rounds. And that is what's needed to seed, to foster, and then open up to the internationalization for a wider scale-up trajectory. So I think there, one thing we need to definitely in Europe, when the regulations allow, is to bring these startups to an international scene and make them compete. The only way to build a unicorn is to make sure that there's competition between the ones that ambition that view. So that competition in the right setting with the right cash and the right ambition, I think is what we need to do.
So large, open, competitive international markets for startups.
Great summary.
Nicola.
Yes, we touch on the question on the scale-ups. So indeed, in the fintech world, we see quite a few of them. Keep in mind that the rate of growth from an investment's perspective, venture capital into fintech in Europe, is higher than the US, Southeast Asia, and China. So venture capital are spending and investing and are nurturing fintechs in Europe. So it's actually the thriving fintech market around the world if you think about acceleration and growth. It's a very long answer to the question what makes them scale up, right? If you think about those neobanks, we could have a couple of panel sessions for the rest of the day on this. But I think it goes back to 3 elements, and I've been working with many of them. One is a clear and consistent regulatory framework, which is transparent, inclusive of all the parties, the incumbents and the new parties, and inclusive of the consumers. If you think about PSD2, that has been, I think, the process. Very structured, very open, very transparent. No partial regulations, but a regulation which was basically holistic. The second point is the access to the networks, right? So those services of those new banks are basically virtual. And so it's easier to tap into a digital network and to start exporting my service from Spain into France or into Brazil or somewhere else, right? So these are actually virtual services. So it's not so much about the infrastructure, which is already there, it's about the services and applications. But I think the third point, which I think is the most important, is the focus on the user experience. Right, so if you think about PSD2, I mean, PSD2 solve some very specific consumer challenges, like, for example, how can I port my data from one service provider, financial service provider, to another one. No. And so those fintechs are all about transforming the user experience and basically make it better for the user. And you see how the incumbents are now answering and raising the quality of the experience from a user perspective to answer to the fintech. So these are, in my opinion, the three elements that I've seen across this industry. My last point is about autonomy versus resilience. Right? And I will argue in the digital spectrum, we are facing similar challenges to the ones we're facing on the energy spectrum. If you think about European energy policy, is it about autonomy, which will never probably happen because we are interconnected. I mean, we are now buying gas not from Russia but from other sources, or is it about resilience? And I will argue a parallel can be drawn to our technology sector and the digital sector in Europe. Are we going to foster resilience versus autonomy? And again, there's a long answer to that. It's a very complex one. But that balance, to me, is something that we need to be kept for the next few years.
Thanks a lot, Nicola. Amaryllis, you had the first word. You will also have the last word. There was a lot of discussion on regulation, so lots of demands on your last views on that.
All right, well, thank you very much. You wanted me also to quickly pick up on the issue of digital diplomacy. What are the priorities? And by the way, I very much agree with what you say, Eva. It's important in the whole huge chantier, which is our work on digital, our joint work on digital, that we keep our priorities right and know where we go and what it is exactly we want to achieve. Digital diplomacy, like any diplomacy, I would say it has multiple functions that are important today. One is internal building. It is also, I think, lots of efforts are about finding strategic partners, as Jo has been underlying, especially important in a context of geopolitical instability, where we have frequent supply chain problems. So supply chain diversity starts with that as well. It is also a question, I think, of indeed keeping that regulatory dialogue. Indeed, the Brussels effect, Europe creates rules, and we are proud to say that then we are the global standard setters, but it doesn't fall from the sky. It only happens if at the same time we work together with our global partners. And by the way, the discussion on AI has started at the same time in Europe, but also at a global level, where there is a lot of interest for what the EU is doing, but also discussions on how actually Europe can be a standard setting. But then going back maybe to the key issue of fragmentation and the role of legislation. Again, regulation is not there to regulate, to restrict, to protect. I get the same negative feelings as you get. It is a role of regulation. But regulation can and should be an enabling instrument, especially if you think about the single market. Because I hear you say, Vincent, for small and medium-sized companies, the sheer fragmentation is a nightmare. Can't we have a special EU regime that applies to them? Well, if we manage regulation well, you get that regime, because that's the effect of maximum harmonization. You get the same rules everywhere. Of course, they need to be the correct rules. Now, and if I may, we're going to celebrate next year 30 years of the single market. And I think Renilde and I agree on one thing. It remains the backbone of a lot what we can do as Europe. And that's the moment to reflect indeed, do we have the right regulatory framework for our SMEs? It is the moment to think again about barriers. But let's also there bear in mind that a lot of the barriers we see today don't require extra regulation. Very often, it is a question of doing away with the administrative red tape, the formalities that are happening at national level. You can't do that away via extra regulation. You have to have a system that is functional. And there I'd like to pick up with the comment that was made also by the audience. E-government is also part and parcel of that. Absolutely. Why is it that as a PME, I don't only need to comply with so many different rules, but I have all the paperwork that I have to do over and over and over again, from one administration to the other. So, if I can stop on a concrete note, yesterday we agreed with the member states, and it was published in the official journal, on a project which will make it easier for companies to make sure that once they have filed their documents in one member state, they can basically reuse it in another member state. Sounds boring, sounds technical, but hey, this is also what a single market is about. It's a huge chantier, but the end goal is to create that enabling space, which will allow our companies, and in particular the PMEs, to thrive. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Amaryllis. And as predicted, actually, on this very important topic, I think we had a very lively discussion, not yet all the answers, but at least raised a lot of important questions. So I like to thank the audience for the comments and the responses, but also particularly for the panel members here. We had a good heterogeneity here in the panel to deal with very many aspects here. And I'm sure we will be continuing the discussion here, and also at Bruegel we will be very clearly and closely following up here. Perhaps one last thought is, given the importance of good regulation here, maybe why would we not be using more digital technologies by data sharing and by experimenting, so that we can actually come up with a better process of generating regulations here. So use digital technologies to come up with better regulation and better evaluation of what works and what doesn't work. It's maybe something we can also think of here too. It's another spin-off that could perhaps be developed. So thanks a lot. There is now lunch here, and after lunch there is still a very interesting program here. So thanks a lot, and see you.